Whether you are a tourist or someone living in Spain, supermarkets are probably a part of your life. And as someone who is passionate about optimizing my grocery shopping, I want to rate the biggest supermarkets in Spain after years of living in Spain and thus years of doing research. We're gonna rank supermarkets that are present in all of Spain and therefore the supermarkets that you're the most likely to run into regardless of your actual location in Spain. I have chosen to rank these supermarkets based on 6 criteria. First of all, the overall affordability, so the prices of the supermarket. Then their selection of basic goods, so staples and things you will always need regardless of who you are basically. Then their selection of specialty items and maybe international options, go-to meals and ready-made food, their bakery options, and finally their fruit and vegetable section. At the very end, I will introduce a little surprise criteria, a little surprise category of something that I personally think can be very important, so I'm curious to see what you think about that one. Let's get right into it with the first one being Mercadona. And Mercadona is a Spanish supermarket chain and they're known for their solid selection of Spanish foods. In particular, their private label, their own store brand called Hacendado, which is pretty much the majority of the shop. Now for rating these supermarkets' affordability, I'm not just gonna go off of my opinion. I have done some research. I have looked at different ratings online to conclude which are the most affordable and which are the most expensive supermarkets in Spain. Now we're rating all of these criteria on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being expensive and 5 being very affordable. And for Mercadona, we are not in the cheap end. Although Mercadona isn't a premium supermarket per se, it definitely isn't cheap. And especially in recent years, and I've had this confirmed in the articles I've read, Mercadona is one of the supermarkets that has increased their prices the most. And that's something you can feel when you go shopping there. For this reason, Mercadona is only getting a 2.5 out of 5. So we're somewhere in the middle here in terms of affordability. Next up, we have the category basic items. So on a scale of 1 to 5, how does Mercadona rank here? Well, this is truly where Mercadona shines, because if we're talking everyday Spanish food, their selection is really good. They have a good selection of bread, of yogurt, of drinks, of snacks, etc. So on a scale from 1 to 5, I would give them a solid 4.5 for basic items. Next up, we have Mercadona's maybe truly weak point, which is their selection of more specialty items, because Mercadona is not necessarily the place to go if you're looking for this specific ingredient for an international recipe, or if you're looking for something that isn't commonly eaten in Spain. The moment the thing you're looking for isn't something that's traditionally found in Spanish cooking, Mercadona is really not the place to go. A couple of examples of things that are hard to find in Mercadona are things like their soy milk. I don't particularly like that. Their selection of tea is very limited. Things like red lentils they don't have. Certain types of chocolate they don't have. And also they don't carry any organic food. Next up, we have the ready-made food category, so meals to go, for example. And here Mercadona also has a pretty decent selection. Basically, you can find anything from fresh sushi to pizza to sandwiches, you name it. So I actually think we have to give them a 5 here, especially when you compare it to the competition, as you will see later on. And similarly for their baking section, I think it deserves a generous 4. First of all, because I feel like the quality in general is really good. The only problem being perhaps that all of the things that they offer are quite similar. So they have a lot of pastries, but they don't have a lot of savory options in the bakery section. Now, next up and the last category is fruits and veggies. Now, here Mercadona deserves a generous 4. They have a good and generally speaking fresh looking selection of fruits and vegetables. The only problem, or the main problem you might say, is that they tend to sell out later in the day. Sometimes if you arrive at Mercadona after 5 p.m., 6 p.m., you'll find sometimes most of the section almost half empty. This is not something I've noticed in other supermarkets. This is very specific to Mercadona. Of course, on the positive side, this means that everything that they offer is really fresh, so it sells out, so they cannot have a lot of extra lying around. But at the same time, if you aren't able to shop early in the day, this can be quite a headache. So when we add all of these scores together and divide them out, this gives Mercadona an average of 3.9 across all categories. Next up, we have Lidl. Now, Lidl is first and foremost characterized by the fact that you tend to find a lot of good parking spaces around, so if that's important to you, Lidl is a great place to go. And also the actual stores tend to be in the medium big category. Now in terms of affordability, Lidl offers great prices. I think this is what Lidl is mostly known for. If you look at the most affordable supermarkets in Spain, Lidl ranks really high. So let's give them a 4.5, not a 5 because they're not the cheapest, but they are almost one of the cheapest. So 4.5 to Lidl for affordability. Here it's really a great option if you want good value for money. For their selection of basic goods, so these things you need on an everyday basis, I'd say Lidl is pretty good. I'd give them a 4 based on the fact that they have almost everything, but I do feel like sometimes some things can be a little bit hard to find, and also some things, even though they carry them, they're temporarily sold out or you cannot find them. So yes, pretty good, a 4 out of 5. In terms of finding more specialized items, Lidl is a little bit of a hit or a miss. They do have international food sections, so if you're looking for something, for example, a bit more Asian or from some other parts of Europe, you can be lucky to find it, but sometimes this is like a temporary offer that they have, so you cannot always be sure to find all of these little special ingredients you might need for some specific recipe that you're cooking, or if you have specific dietary requirements, Lidl can be a little bit of a hit and miss in that sense. In terms of their to-go meal section, they do not really specialize in this. They do have a couple of things you can grab to go, but this is not really where Lidl shines. So I'm just gonna give them a 3 because they have some options, but this is not really their main focus. For their bakery section, this is another great reason to visit Lidl. Now I'm gonna give them a 4.5 because in general they have a good selection of bakery goods, both in the savory section, so they have these really nice, I think it's like a spinach pastry that tastes really good. They have many different types of croissants, of bread, etc. The only reason I'm not giving them a 5 is because some Lidls don't have all of these, so I don't want to give them a 5 because I don't want you to show up there and expect them to have all of these things, because some of the old Lidls especially don't have as many options, but in general the options that they do have are varied and good. Now in terms of their fruits and vegetables, they have a pretty decent selection, nothing special. They have the fruits and vegetables that you would imagine to find in Spain, so let's give them a plain 4 for this. That means that Lidl on average gets a 4 out of 5, so it's already ahead of Mercadona. Let's see how the next supermarkets compare. Next up we have the supermarkets Carrefour. Now Carrefour has different sizes of supermarkets, and in this rating I'm talking about the very big supermarket Carrefour and also the one that is sort of medium sized. So we're not talking about the city Carrefour, so the small, very expensive ones in the city. In general, Carrefour is the kind of supermarket you go to if you need something specific. For example, something you cannot find anywhere else. At least that's what I use Carrefour for, because in terms of affordability, Carrefour is not a good place to go. Now, if you look at rankings of the most expensive supermarkets in Spain, Carrefour ranks pretty high. So in terms of affordability, I'm gonna have to give it a 1 because this is not an affordable option, the only exception being their own store brand. Now in terms of their selection of basic goods, I'm gonna have to give them a 5 because they basically have every kind of staple that you might think of. So for this, Carrefour is great. Now for specialty items, Carrefour again is a really good option. Like I said, if you're looking for something specific, like an ingredient or a brand or something you cannot find anywhere else, chances are that you might find it in Carrefour. The only thing is that they don't have a whole lot of organic options. I cannot really give them a 5 here, but I will give them a 4.8, which I think very well represents their selection. Now in terms of to-go meals and ready-made food, this is not really something they specialize in, but they do have a variety of these things. So let's just go ahead and give them a 3. Similarly for their bakery section, even in the very big Carrefour that have like a big bakery bake-off section, I actually don't think that their baked goods look that appetizing. Maybe it's just me. I'm not really a big fan of Carrefour's bakery options, so I'm only gonna have to give them a 3.5 here because the competition is so high from places like Lidl and Mercadona. For their fruits and vegetables, I feel like we can give them a solid 3.5. Even the really big Carrefours, which you would maybe imagine would have a lot of of options. I still feel like there's some types of vegetables that they don't have, and I cannot help but compare the Carrefour in Spain to the Carrefour in France where I used to live. And also for the specialty items, similarly, I feel like the Carrefours in Spain and France, which have sort of the big ones, which have a similar size, I somehow feel like the ones in France just had a much wider selection of basically everything. I don't really know exactly why that is. I find it very interesting as like a merchandising strategy, why it's so different. So in that sense, I can only give Carrefour a 3.5 for the fruits and vegetables. And that means the overall score for Carrefour is a 3.5. Alright, next up we are rating the supermarket Aldi. Now Aldi is a little bit of a wild card. It's kind of hard to describe. I'm actually not sure what their overall brand strategy is in Spain. Perhaps their overall strategy is to carry some specialty high-end items, but we'll get to that. First of all, is Aldi in Spain affordable? Not really. They're not in the most expensive supermarkets. They're also not really in the least expensive group of supermarkets. I did look online to see how they compare to, for example, Mercadona. It turns out that they're somewhat similar to Mercadona, but I think the biggest difference is that Aldi has a bigger variety. Like they have some items that they carry that are really expensive, and then they also have some really good budget options, whereas Mercadona is a little bit more all in the middle. So I'm actually gonna give them a 2.5 similarly to Mercadona. In terms of their selection of basic items, now this is where I feel like we have the main issue with Aldi, and something that I find to be very interesting, because Aldi just doesn't have some very basic things. I remember being in Aldi a couple of times and having basic things on my list, like it could be some ketchup or some type of sauce or some type of yogurt, and going to look for it in the section and not being able to find it. So for basic foods we can only give them a 2, but this is where it gets really interesting, because although Aldi is sort of lacking in the basic food section, they do have a lot of very interesting items. So I'm actually gonna give Aldi a 5 in the specialty items category, because first of all, they have a great selection of organic food sort of across the shop, especially considering the size of the supermarkets, because Aldi in Spain, it isn't a particularly big shop, but they do carry a lot of really great organic options, and they also have a lot of interesting specialty items, like for example tempeh, which is this Southeast Asian soy product that I personally really like and cannot find anywhere else, and they have it in Aldi. Aldi is great for these things that you didn't know you could find in Spain, but here they are. In terms of to-go meals, again, Aldi doesn't really specialize in this, but I actually do think they have some hidden gems in that section. They have some nice like couscous salads you can grab on the go, so I think I'm going to give them a 3.8. Their bakery section, again, isn't something I think that they put a lot of emphasis on. They have basic breads, but they don't really have like a big pastry section, so let's give them a 3. And for fruits and vegetables, again, this is something that Aldi does quite well, even though their fruits and veggies section isn't particularly big. They managed to carry some very interesting, especially vegetables. You can find some vegetables that are typically used in Asian cooking that you won't find in places like Mercadona, for example. So yeah, let's give them a good 4.5 for the vegetables. When we add all of these together, it turns out that Aldi also gets an overall 3.5 rating. Alright, we're getting towards the end of this little competition, and the last supermarket we're rating is the one called Dia. And Dia is also a bit of a difficult one to describe, because I think they have changed their overall merchandising strategy in recent years. It used to be this like very basic, kind of boring place to walk around, but I've been recently and they have really made some changes, and they're carrying some more interesting items, but we'll get to that. In terms of affordability, Dia is in the more affordable end of the scale without being downright cheap, so let's give them a 3.5. In terms of their selection of basic goods, they are pretty well covered, but some of the shops aren't necessarily that big, so let's give them a 3.5 here as well. In terms of specialty items, this is actually something that has really improved with Dia over recent years, because they end up carrying some very interesting things. For example, there's this tea that I really like that I always have to buy on Amazon. They don't even have it in the big Carrefour, but I can find it in a place like Dia. So you do find these little interesting things that you thought you would have to buy online, and therefore Dia gets a 4.5 here. In terms of to-go meals, again, I don't think Dia is really specialized in this. I haven't seen much that sort of falls into this category, except for some maybe very basic sandwiches, so Dia will only get a 2 here. Again, their bakery section, this doesn't seem like something they particularly specialize in. It doesn't look as fresh and appetizing as some of the other supermarkets we've rated, so Dia also only gets a 2 here. For the fruits and vegetables, I actually have pretty decent experiences with the fruits and vegetables they have in Dia. They do carry some things that you don't necessarily find in other places, like these sort of like red peppers that are kind of long. I really like them for cooking. They're really hard to find, but Dia has them. I've also bought some great avocados there in the past, so let's give them a solid 4. And that means that the overall rating for Dia is 3.25. I was actually really curious to see which supermarket would win this ranking, because I had a feeling that it would be almost a tie between Mercadona and Lidl, and it turns out that it is. In my opinion, Mercadona and Lidl are overall the 2 best options for doing grocery shopping in Spain. Now, depending on what's important to you specifically when doing grocery shopping, the overall rating may not be as important as some of the individual criteria we looked at, and of course other things like proximity to your location, which we also cannot assess in this ranking, is equally very important to most people, and perhaps also things like the parking situation. And maybe for many of us, the affordability aspect is maybe a tad more important than some of the other categories. But even if we give more importance to this criteria, Lidl would be an even more clear winner because Lidl ranks really high on affordability. But now, as promised, I want to introduce a little extra category, being, I want to call it the inspiration factor, meaning when you go into the shop, do you become inspired? That means, first of all, the sort of overall shopping experience, but also whether or not the display that they have and the selection of goods, whether or not it inspires you to, for example, try something new. And here it gets interesting because I think both Mercadona and Lidl score pretty high in this category, but for slightly different reasons. So Lidl would get a high score in this category because Lidl tends to have these interesting little sort of surprise aisles where you will find anything from garden equipment to big shampoo bottles to exotic food items. You really never know what you're gonna get, and on top of that, they sometimes have these sections of food from a specific cuisine. For example, sometimes they have a section with Greek food, so you can become inspired this way. You truly never know what you might encounter. Now, Mercadona is the exact opposite in the sense that Mercadona almost always has the exact same selection of goods, only varying a little bit over, for example, Christmas with like these chocolate calendars and a few other seasonal items, but other than that, Mercadona is the same thing, same prizes every day, all year, every year. So what's inspiring about going to Mercadona is more the fact that I think they're very good at displaying their items. Some supermarkets, you know, can feel a little bit cluttered, but Mercadona feels very organized. They have their fruits and vegetables on like nice displays. There's like a section with fresh fish and seafood, again, very well organized. It's a nice experience for the brain to go there because you don't feel like you're bombarded with too many options, but you're given options that look nice. For the other supermarkets, Aldi is a little similar to Lidl in the sense that they also have this like surprise aisle where you never know what you're gonna find. In terms of the supermarket Dia, again, I feel like Dia is not the most exciting place to go. I also feel like their stores can feel a little bit cluttered, and you can also feel the aisles are just kind of narrow. And for Carrefour, well, especially the big Carrefour, which is maybe one of the biggest, if not the biggest supermarket in Spain, of course you get very inspired because you can find so many different types of foods. But actually I feel like it can be a little bit too overwhelming, so sometimes there's a fine line between feeling inspired and being overwhelmed. So again, for this category, we're back to the winners from the first place, which are Mercadona and Lidl. Maybe Lidl having a slight edge over Mercadona. So yeah, I don't think that changes much in terms of the overall competition between Mercadona and Lidl. Lidl still taking the lead, especially if we give more weight to the pricing, the affordability aspect, as I think most people can agree is very important. But as always, I'm very curious to know what you guys think. So if you've been to a Spanish supermarket, if you've been to any of these Spanish supermarkets, if you have a favorite supermarket, please let me know in the comments if you agree with this rating, if there's something else we should have looked at. And don't hesitate to share if you have any tips for grocery shopping in Spain. I made another video about shopping specifically in Mercadona. Feel free to check that out. Alright, I've got nothing. Alright, thank you so much for watching. Alright, thank you so much for watching, and see you soon in the next video. Bye!